Dr. Jack Shonkoff has been here and who has done a deep research in this science of early childhood and who actually will share with us the science and also, in fact, he has been working with a lot of policymakers, especially in the United States and also across the globe. And we would like to hear from him. And thereafter, we also would like to hear from our Dr. V.K. Paul, our honorable member Niti Aayog, and we'll conclude with the vision sharing by our Chief Minister. So I will, without taking much of the time, I would like to welcome Dr. Jack Shonkoff. I think about him, actually, I just shared with you, he has been the professor at Harvard University, and also he has been the director of Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, which conducts a lot of research and provides a lot of support to the policy makers. And he's also the chair of National Scientific Council on Developing Child in the US. He led a committee that produced a landmark report on ECD from neurons to the neighborhoods, especially talking about the science of early childhood, how actually we can use that to drive policy and innovations. So over to you, Dr. Jack Shonkoff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And it's really an honor for me to be here today. And I have to say, I want to pay particular tribute to Sampath Kumar, who is a former student of mine, who first reached out to me about this exciting vision that you have for this region in the country. So it's a delight for me to be here. The title of my presentation is Leveraging Advances in Science to Strengthen the Common Foundations of Early Childhood Development and Adult Productivity and Lifelong Health. This is really a kind of wonderful opportunity for me to share the science with you and then to kind of have a conversation about how this works in your country and in your region, because the science is the same everywhere. This is the basic science of human development, but how we use it varies very much with context. So just want to kind of say from the beginning that for me, there are three converging lenses to think about investment in the prenatal period and in the early childhood years. The first, which has always been a guiding light for me throughout my career, is the moral responsibility to care for all children and to kind of create the kind of environments in which each child has the opportunity to reach full potential. There's a second lens, which is thinking about early childhood as a foundation for sustainable society. This is not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, because all of the characteristics of a healthy population that make for a healthy society have their beginnings in early childhood. And what I'm going to focus on with you this evening is a third lens, which is one that is really shaping a lot of our work right now, is that there are tremendous advances in science, in the science of early childhood, and we're not using a lot of this new knowledge. So there's really untapped power of the kind of rapidly moving frontiers of developmental biology, which I will give you a kind of an overview of in this session, but also recognizing that no matter how strong the science is, it has to connect with the lived experiences of families raising young children, of people who work in programs, people who develop policy. So this is not a matter of taking the science off the shelf and saying, so go do this. It really has to fit with the context in which people are raising children and providing services and developing policies. Now, if we think about how science, and really 21st century science I'm talking about right now, kind of building on what we know about child development, but now bringing to the table what we know about the underlying biology of early learning and of roots of lifelong health. That science begins by understanding why early experiences are so important for the developing brain. In this one slide, I'm going to summarize what's basically been the last 10 years of research in this area, which is the following: that if we think about what we call the plasticity of the brain, how adaptable is the brain? How much can it adjust and react to new challenges? That adaptability, that plasticity is at its highest level when we're born, and it decreases quite dramatically in the early childhood years and then kind of continues to decrease over our life course. It doesn't mean that we can't learn things as we get older, but it means our brain is less adaptable. And And what that means is that the cost, the actual biological cost to the brain to modify its connections, to kind of try to undo old habits, get around old behaviors, that costs more for the brain as time goes on, and also costs more for society. So early really matters. It's never too late to kind of try to improve outcomes, but it's easier and more effective to start earlier. So I'm going to now give you three basic concepts that are coming from the leading edge of the biology of adversity and resilience right now. This is kind of where science is at this time. And it's deepening our understanding of how both health and development begin early in life. And there are three concepts that I'm going to put on the table right now, and then I'm going to go into them in more detail as the session goes on. The first is this notion of connecting the brain to the rest of the body. The way in which science has been brought into the early childhood field, particularly over the last 10 to 20 years, has focused on the impact of experience on brain development. And everything that we've known about that and learned about that over this last 2 decades still is very true, but it's not just about the brain. It's also about the immune system. It's also about metabolic systems, and all of these are interconnected. So it's not just about the brain. Secondly, we now know, we have tremendous evidence about this very important concept of variation in sensitivity to the environment. Each of us has a unique genetic endowment, and we vary in terms of how sensitive we are to the environment. Anybody who's seen more than 2 children in one family knows that children, even living in the same family with the same parents, are different in their sensitivity to what's going on. So we have to be thinking more about variability and not just asking, like, what's the best thing for children, or what's the best thing for poverty, because there's a lot of variation. And the third issue is the importance of timing and critical periods. We've known a lot about this for the brain for many decades. There's some important things that happen in brain development in the prenatal period, in the first 1 to 2 years after birth, that are very hard to change later. But now we know the same is true for other biological systems, like the development of the immune system and metabolic systems. So it brings more and more the importance of beginning early, and early really means very early in pregnancy, if not before conception. So what I want to do now in this next slide is to kind of share with you the fact that this focus on brain development, this focus on early experiences, which is all very sound, has actually gotten much more sophisticated. And what we've done in our center just over the last few months is to say that we really, the science is moving so quickly that it's time for a mindset shift in the early childhood policy arena, informed by very rigorous science and lived experience. And I'm going to give you the highlights of what is really we only put this up on our website about 6 months ago. So this is kind of brand new, but to say that the science of early childhood is actually much broader and deeper than we've appreciated over the last 10 years. And here are some of the differences. So we're now calling what's been conventionally thought of as early childhood development 1.0, that's science. It's about early brain development. It's about the importance of the environment of relationships in which children are growing up, their interactions with the parents and other family members and people who work in programs. And this is all still very, very important. But ECD 2.0, and I'm going to give you some of the highlights in a second, is telling us, number one, really underscoring this fact that it's not just about the brain. The brain is connected to the rest of the body. And then we have to be thinking not only about the critical importance of adult-child relationships, but the broader environment in which children are growing up. So here are 4 basic principles of what we would now say constitute the new science of early childhood development, the expanded science that builds on everything. You don't have to throw out what we already know. We're building on it. But here are 4 basic concepts. It's still very much about readiness to succeed in school. It's also about the early origins of lifelong physical and mental health. This is as much an issue for the Ministry of Health as it is for the Ministry of Education. Next, it's still about providing enrichment for developing minds, the importance of children being exposed to talking and reading to children, and this kind of these enriched learning experiences, but it's also about protecting developing brains and other biological systems from significant adversity, particularly what we call toxic stress and other environmental exposures. It's still about the hardships of poverty. It's very much about poverty. It's also about the threats and burdens of racism and other forms of marginalization that are very often associated with poverty, but are not the same as poverty. And we need to start paying more attention to issues related to marginalization and structural inequities. And then finally, it's still very much about nurturing relationships, absolutely. But it's also about building a health-promoting society. The answer in the early childhood field is not just what parents can do. It's not just what programs can do. It's about how the broader political and economic and social context are either supporting and promoting healthy development or undermining it. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to do a deeper dive into the biology with you. And I'm going to give you a crash course in the biology of stress. And so that you'll kind of understand that this is not just a slogan, and to see where some of the exciting research is, and understand that stress has both benefits and harms. That there's no such thing as a stress-free environment. So the goal here is not to eliminate stress in children's lives, but to kind of have it be manageable and not cause harm. And that stress basically gets into the body. So I'm going to walk you through a somewhat complicated slide, but make it fairly kind of simple with some very important sources of knowledge and information and science. So everything that we might look at, whether it's related to learning or behavior or physical or mental health, is a result of the interaction between individual genetic variation. Each of us is uniquely wired biologically, unless you have an identical twin. But that genetic endowment does not determine things by itself. It is highly influenced by the environment in which we live. And the environment alone doesn't determine this, because individuals respond differently. So the interaction between individual genetic variation, stressors in the environment, and developmental timing. It matters whether you're a fetus or a 1-month-old or a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 25-year-old. These things matter based on age as well as interaction between genetics and environment. So what I'm going to do now is kind of take you through a whirlwind tour of what the stress response system looks like inside your body. So all of us know, every one of you, I don't know any of you personally, you're all successful adults, you know what stress feels like. You know when you're seriously stressed, you know the physical sensation of feeling stress. It's not just a thought, but it's a physical feeling. So here's what's going on inside your body, all of us. And this is true for all animal species. All animal species have a stress response system, and it's similar. And here's what happens when we are threatened, when we are stressed. A series of biological, physiological responses happen inside the body. Stress hormone levels increase in our bloodstream. Our heart rate and our blood pressure increase. Stress hormone increases are good because what those stress hormones do, with cortisol being the most common, is they have an effect on our brain. They make us more alert. They mobilize our stress response system, so-called fight or flight response. They gear our body up for dealing with stress, whether it be to kind of think your way out of a threat or fight your way out or run. Stress hormones galvanize the whole system. Your heart rate and blood pressure go up to pump blood more rapidly all through your body to bring energy stores to your brain and to your muscles. Your inflammatory system is activated, which is the part of the immune system that fights infection and works on wound healing. So already your body is preparing to be injured. It's preparing to be cut. It's preparing to fight infection. It's preparing to be able to heal wounds. Your metabolic systems are activated, producing more energy for all of the cells in the body to be able to think more clearly, to act more quickly, to be stronger, to be faster. There's something called epigenetics. I'm going to get to that. All of these things are good, by the way. You can see this is what allows us to kind of deal with threat. This is good. This is great about having a stress response system. Epigenetic effects I'm going to hold for a second. I don't have much time to get into that. But this has to do with the cutting edge of the frontier of molecular biology. It helps us understand how experience actually affects the way genes work. And then, of course, there's a circuitry, the electrical activity in the brain that immobilizes parts of the brain that help you focus your attention, rapid memory recall. So all of this in an acute situation is how the stress response system is life-saving. It's good. If it didn't work, we would not survive. That's why all animal species have one. But the stress response system was not meant to be activated most of the time. It was meant to ramp up, deal with threat, have the threat be mastered, and then have the stress system go back to baseline. And the problem is, and then now we're going to speak primarily about very young children, is that when the sources of stress remain high most of the time, and the stress response system is activated for prolonged periods of time at a high level, what is life-saving in the short term then starts to have a wear and tear effect on the body. So chronically elevated stress hormones go from helping you become more focused with better attention to actually starting to disrupt circuits in the brain related to memory, and disrupt and activate circuits related to the fear response, and actually can have biological effects on your bones and cause osteoporosis. So stress hormones are great when you're acutely stressed. They start to have a wear and tear effect, and they produce problems if they don't come back down to baseline. Inflammation is one of the most important areas in biomedical research right now. As important it is to fight infection and to deal with wound healing, when the inflammatory system stays highly elevated, it starts to have a very disruptive effect on many organ systems. It can increase the rate of atherosclerosis and make you much more likely to get heart disease and a heart attack. Chronic inflammation is associated with much higher risk for major depressive disorders. So there are effects on emotions, there are effects on mental health, there are effects on physical health if the inflammation stays high. Metabolic regulation, fantastic to get your cells activated with more glucose for energy to act. But if it stays high all the time, then you start to develop insulin resistance, which leads to metabolic syndrome, which leads to obesity, which leads to diabetes, which can also affect cognitive function. So it goes in the chronic state to now being a source of chronic illness. And epigenetic effects, which are basically turning genes on and turning them off. When children are very young, prenatally and in infancy, some of these effects can be very difficult to reverse later on. This is why children who are born after pregnancies when there's been severe malnutrition and have very low birth weight as a result of low nutrition, the metabolic systems as they're developing before birth are sensing not enough food, so they work on conserving calories. That gets fixed for life. Then you're born. Then if you're fed well, you're at greater risk for obesity because your metabolic system has been prepped for a lifetime of food scarcity, and it's very hard to change that. So this general sense here is that the biology of stress is telling us why children, it's opening up that black box. Why do children who grow up in very severe poverty with constant stress, why do they have more problems learning? Why do they have more chronic diseases as they get older? And the answer is not motivation. The answer is not something you will. It's basic biology. It's the consequences of the wear and tear effect of chronic stress activation. So it's very important whenever we talk about stress to recognize that we also have to talk about resilience at the same time. Because this is not a doom and gloom story necessarily. For children living in poverty, for children experiencing exposure to violence, children who are experiencing the oppression of chronic inequities related to racism and marginalization. The flip side of the stress story and the adversity story is the resilience story. How can we build resilience in the face of adversity? And so the first thing we have to understand is that although children are born, as I said earlier, everyone's born different, unique in every different way. So we know right from birth, if you were in a nursery and just saw, hundreds or thousands of newborns in a newborn nursery in a hospital, the nurses who work there can tell you that babies are different from the very beginning. Some are more irritable and hard to soothe, and they cry a lot, and some seem pretty mellow, and some establish pretty kind of comfortable sleeping patterns, and some are up all the time. All normal. We're not talking about pathology, we're talking about normal variation. So clearly, each of us from the beginning, by our genetic endowment, is kind of more or less adaptable, okay? All within a normal range. But that's not fixed. It is not fixed. It's not something that can't be changed over time. The other side of this is that when we look at resilience later in childhood or adolescence or adulthood, and we look at individuals who've experienced tremendous adversity early in their lives and do remarkably well, and do well in school and are healthy. And we kind of look at that and we name that. That's the definition of resilience. And we say, well, look at that person. And then if someone says, so why can't everybody be like that? Why don't people just kind of work hard to be more resilient? Well, the answer is you can't make yourself resilient alone. But we know from decades and decades of research on resilience in the face of poverty, resilience in the face of war, resilience in the face of genocide, resilience in the face of serious mental health problems in a family, chronic exposure to community violence or family violence. The one thing that comes out in every study is that those who do well, in spite of adversity, can always identify at least one important relationship that provided a sense of security and safety and buffering protection. So we know that resilience can be built. We know it can be strengthened, but you can't do it on your own. So I'm going to use this schematic on the slide here as a metaphor for how we think about risk factors and protective factors, how we think about sources of likelihood of greater chances of negative outcomes, poor health, poor learning, economic dependence, or positive outcomes, healthy, self-sufficient, competent. And generally speaking, as a principle, we can say all of us have some mix of risk factors and protective factors in our lives. None of us live in a completely risk-free environment, and none of us kind of have all of the protective factors you could hope for. But generally speaking, if you think of this as a balance, if you have more positive protective factors on the right side than you have risk factors on the left side, scale will tip and you're more likely to have a positive outcome. That's kind of an average. And what are the most common protective factors that tilt things toward positive outcomes? Obviously, it starts with responsive relationships, as I mentioned, but there are other things outside of just the caregiving role of the family that tip toward positive outcomes. Supportive services can make a very big difference. Robust social capital, the kind of sense of community in which people live, the sense of belonging, the sense of being in an environment that can provide protection and safety and not just be an environment of threat. And there's a lot of research that shows that faith and cultural traditions can be very much a contributor to these protective factors. So we know what a lot of these are. We think about how both in terms of informal community supports and formal programs, we can tilt the balance toward positive outcomes. But there's a part of the population, this is back to the individual variation issue, that even in the face of a lot of protective factors is more at risk. This is getting back to this issue of individual variation. So if you think about, again, this is a metaphor, it's not really the way it works in the body. When we look at a balance or a teeter-totter, we have this sense of a fulcrum that's in the middle of that balance. But there are some parts of the population, estimated to be about 15 to 20% of the population, where people are kind of constitutionally just more sensitive, more likely to kind of be overwhelmed by negative forces. And so if you think about this, in a sense, their fulcrum at birth is kind of moved to the right. So here, even in the face of a lot of protective factors, things might still tilt to the negative because of extreme sensitivity to the environment. Well, the good news is that's not fixed. That's one of the most important messages for me to communicate to you, is that genetic differences, for all the things we're talking about, are not fixed. They're predispositions, they're probabilities. And we can move that fulcrum by strengthening adaptive skills, strengthening the kind of coping skills, and I'll say a little bit about that in a few minutes, that help overcome adversity. And here, in this case, you can actually then move things toward positive outcomes just by building this sense of self-efficacy and coping capacities that will help children develop better outcomes, but you can't do it on your own. It's done by the support of adults. So if I kind of summarize all of this science and kind of think about how it might be translated into policy and practice. This is the part that I want to kind of tee up for the conversation because it's kind of really important for making science actionable. Everything I've said to you so far and shared with you this evening is basically making science accessible. It's in deepening understanding of what's going on inside the body. What is it about stress? What is it about adversity? What is it about violence? What is it about all of these threats to well-being that actually get into the body and result in illness or result in poor learning capacity or result in poorly adaptive behavior? How does that happen? So I've kind of shared with you a little bit about what's going on inside the body. But now the question is, so what do we do with this understanding? How do we improve the impacts of parenting and caregiving? How do we improve the impacts of services that are provided, some informal, some voluntary, some funded by government? And how do we do that across sectors? So this is basically this science that I just shared with you is the science of early childhood health and development. It's about learning. It's about behavior. It's about mental health. It's about physical health. So the science has applicability across sectors. I know this is an important issue that you're dealing with right now, and I congratulate you for that. Every sector should be looking at what I'm about to share with you and say, how can this influence what we do? Whether we're about health, whether we're about nutrition, whether we're about human welfare or child welfare, whether we're about economic development. 3 basic principles grounded in very strong science. And none of these will be surprising to you based on what I've just presented and what you already know. At first, everything always starts with responsive adult-child relationships. So whether you're thinking about programs, whether you're thinking about systems, whether you think about the delivery of health services, thinking about the provision of early childhood education, everything we do, we should look at and say, so how is what we're doing supporting and strengthening the relationships between parents and their children? And so if a program is focusing just on the children and not the parents, we should be asking, how do we involve the parents more? Because it's their interactions with the child that will always be more important than just what happens in an early childhood program. And I don't know enough about the circumstances in your region right now, but if you're having trouble like everybody else does in the world, basically having enough people to kind of provide the staffing for a lot of these early care and education programs. So I know in the US, we have terrible problems with staff turnover, terrible problems with people coming and leaving the jobs. And so we tend to think of that as, well, that's a problem for the leadership of the center because you have to recruit new people and you have to train them, and that's expensive and it's inefficient. But from a science point of view also, every time someone leaves the program, the children who that person is working with are losing an important relationship. And when a new person comes in, they have to develop a new relationship. That's disruptive for child development. It's not just an administrative hassle. The second principle is strengthening core skills in context. So this is a very controversial area in the US right now, and I'm sure it really is applicable everywhere in the world. A lot of the kind of scientific knowledge and academic knowledge we have about core skills that are necessary for preparation for educational success comes from studies that are mostly done on middle-class families and often have to do with the skills that children learn about how to kind of control your impulses, how to focus your attention, how to engage in goal-directed behavior, how to delay gratification. A lot of these what so-called executive function and self-regulation skills that develop rapidly in the later early childhood years. These are not skills that come in automatically. It's not like sitting and crawling and walking and speaking words. They don't come automatically. They have to be modeled and scaffolded by the adults who care for young children. And if the adults who care for young children, because of their own childhood, do not have strong skills in delayed gratification and goal-directed behavior and have problems with self-regulation and impulsivity, then there's a need to help strengthen those skills in the caregivers so that they can model those skills for the children. And these skills don't get learned by getting a lecture about how to sit still and how to delay gratification. They get learned by coaching and practice. That's how children learn it from their parents, and how adults who don't have the skills learn them in programs. And the beauty of a coaching and practice model is it's not a deficit model. Elite athletes have coaches and they practice and train all the time. So all of us could strengthen our skills, but this is a very important part of what science is telling us about these skills. And in some environments, the core skills are different. An environment, when you live in an environment of chronic violence, unpredictability, and uncertainty, the core skills that you need are very different from the skills you need in an environment that's very well regulated. So we have to think more broadly about the context in which families are raising children, to think about what are the core skills, how do we build them, and how do we measure them. And then, of course, the third principle is reducing sources of significant stress. The answer cannot be, when families who are living in highly stressful environments, particularly related to poverty and violence, the answer is not just help them cope better, but the answer has to be, how do we reduce these sources of stress to make it easier for families to raise their children? So supporting relationships, strengthening core skills, reducing sources of stress. You can look at every program, ask how are we doing in these areas. You can look at every policy and say, how are we doing in these areas? This is making this science actionable. This is having science-informed practice. So, of course, the devil is in the details of how do you do this? And when do you do it? And when is it most important? And that's where, again, this has to be looked at just in the context of where people are living, what their resources are. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. The science is the same, but the application varies with the context. So I want to leave you with kind of two messages that kind of really relate to this issue of variation in effectiveness of programs, and then how we deal about iteration and improving what we do. So I'm going to share with you now a very important lesson to be learned from 40 years of progress treating the most common cancer in children, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. This is cancer is relatively rare in children. This is the most common cancer. And here's some very important findings that have lessons to be taught to the early childhood field. So these are taken from data in the United States, although it includes some global data, but it's largely US data. In 1964, the 5-year survival rate for this disease was about 3%. So almost everybody didn't live more than 5 years. It was a uniformly fatal disease. And at that time, that was 1 year before Head Start was begun in the United States, kind of first anti-poverty program focused on kind of early enrichment for children living in poverty. And in the early studies of Head Start, the average effect size of the program, the average effect size was about 1/4 of a standard deviation. 10 years later, the 5-year survival rate for leukemia was 60%, and the average effect size for Head Start was about 1/4 of a standard deviation. Still positive, but not getting higher. This is now, these are 15-year-old data. It's gotten better since then, but it's getting close to the high 90s. The 5-year survival rate was way over 90%. Now it's over 95%. And the average effect size of Head Start is about 1/4 of a standard deviation. So what's the lesson here? Not to equate poverty with cancer, but there's a very important lesson about how this dramatic improvement in effectiveness and outcomes was achieved for cancer. So here's the punchline. I will tell you, and you may be surprised by this, in fact, you'll be shocked by it if you don't know anything about cancer treatment. And in the last 25 to 30 years, there has not been one new treatment developed for acute leukemia in children, not one new treatment. And yet the survival rates have dramatically increased. And the reason is because of all the treatments that were available, have been available for more than 3 decades. People started to study the disease more and found out that there were many different subtypes of leukemia. They weren't all the same. And when they started to kind of ask the question of not what's the best treatment, but which of all of the treatments we have work the best for different subgroups, that's when the progress was made. So now at the time of diagnosis, you don't say what's the treatment for leukemia, you say which type do you have, you figure it out, you match it, and you have these dramatic impacts. And still to this day, when we look at our programs for poverty, we're still asking what's the best program for children living in poverty. We're missing the point that there is no one program for children living in poverty. It depends on, is it poverty in an otherwise well-functioning family? Is it poverty plus exposure to violence? Is it poverty plus dealing with racism? Is it poverty plus mental illness in the family, maternal depression? Is it poverty plus addictions? And that's the kind of way in which we make progress, is we figure out what the different variations are of what the challenge is. So the last slide with lessons to be learned is kind of going into another whole world. This is the world of Apple computer. Okay? And I think this is an iconic country, an iconic company that has produced some amazing products that are kind of penetrated the entire world. So what I'm going to do now is take you through a very quick 30-year road to game-changing achievements at Apple, with the lessons of the importance of having a bold vision, making strategic investments, and learning from failure. So here's the Apple story. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak invented a little personal computer in a garage. And 1 year later, they formed a company. And that company began with this revolutionary concept of a personal computer. And then over the next 10 years plus, they tried to kind of develop more commercial variations of this. Most people don't even remember these things. In 1983, something called the Apple Lisa personal computer was rolled out, and it was a huge commercial failure. And then the year after that, the Macintosh was released, and that was much more successful. And then another decade went by, and they weren't just sitting in their laboratories looking at the walls. They were working incredibly hard to develop new devices based on this new technology. So in 1993, the Apple Newton was developed. This was a personal digital it was kind of like a personal thing for taking, in your hand. You could make notes and keep records of things, and it was a colossal failure. And 2 years after that, they had a Pip and game console, which was kind of like one of these video games for kids, and that was a complete flop. And then 3 years later, they developed the iMac, which was a huge success. And then years after that, there was a rapid explosion of the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and a whole lot of other stuff that's come since then. But the part to remember here is, and the lesson learned, is it was decades. They didn't, when the first iPod and iPhone came out, they didn't just start working on that the year before. They were working on that for years, failure after failure after failure. And they didn't hide the failure. They used the failure as a time to figure out, what did we do wrong? What should we do differently? So kind of here's the very important lesson, not just the leukemia story of looking at individual variation and what works for whom, but in the Apple story is the way breakthroughs are made, is you have a bold vision. You never doubt that you're going to have some really big breakthroughs. And you make strategic investments, and you double down when things look promising, and you stop doing things that aren't working, and you figure out why it didn't work, why it didn't have as big an impact as you wanted, and figure out what to do differently. And you don't hide your failures. You open them up as an opportunity to learn. This is, again, about adapting to the environment. In the early childhood world, you have tremendous successes all over the place and model programs that have made a big difference for children. But when we try to go to scale, we've often been disappointed. And then the problem is that the environment in which we're doing this is demanding instant results. It's saying, I want to see big impacts in 2 to 3 years, or else I'm going to stop giving you the funding. And if that's the way all these other fields work, nothing would gain and make progress anywhere, because progress comes from learning from what's working, learning from what's not, making strategic changes along the way, always setting a high bar and doing whatever it takes to get there. The leukemia story is a big success story in cancer. There are other forms of cancer that are still uniformly fatal. Pancreatic cancer is a good example. It has a 5-year survival rate that's no better than the 5-year survival rate for leukemia 50 years ago. But nobody is saying, well, you know, they haven't figured it out yet, so why don't we just stop paying for them? We say we're going to do it until we figure it out. That's what we need to do in early childhood. Capitalize on where we're making a big impact, but find those areas where we're not and figure out what to do differently. So I'm going to end with this quote from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who many of you may know about. She was former president of Liberia. She was the first female president of an African nation and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, an incredibly visionary leader. And she said, if your dreams do not scare you, they're not big enough. So the thought that I want to leave you with here is that the science is screaming at us that so much of importance is happening in early childhood. We have a very rapidly moving frontier of new science coming out all the time. We're dealing with very complex challenges of poverty and violence and a variety of other factors that put tremendous burdens on children and families and produce great disparities still in outcomes. But we should never doubt that the knowledge is only getting stronger. It's the political will and it's the ingenuity and it's the creativity that we need to kind of make dramatic improvements in the health and the developmental competence of children, which is what makes for a healthy society. So I'm going to leave you with this last slide, which has the URL for our center's website, developingchild.harvard.edu. We have a huge amount of material on there that translates and makes accessible complex science for policymakers and service providers and the general public. So I welcome you, if you want to know more about this, to please go to our website. And I will stop right here and very much look forward to an interactive conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Shonkoff. Thank you very much. It's a great presentation. And you ended with a statement that, we need to dream. In fact, I would like to say this one, that, Meghalaya is a small state, but it's a very challenging state because we have, different challenges, geographical challenges and various other challenges. But we have, the state has got a dream now. In fact, the state is endowed with a nature capital, and it has a beautiful cultural capital because 85% of the population of the state is indigenous population. And we really wanted to build the state as a cognitive capital. So we really wanted to understand and invest in the early childhood period. In fact, our Honorable Chief Minister, under his leadership, we have launched a state early childhood development mission, and where actually we are focusing on those systemic issues, what is missing, how actually we can really address that problem, so that like if you invest now, I think we can really see those benefits later. So we are taking all these concepts and we launched a statewide mission. And we have, as a starter, I wanted to tell you what you mentioned, where to make this happen, you said a robust social capital. So what, with the government of India's, the vision, what we did was we have built the mothers groups, like, it's a kind of a self-help groups across the state. So who are going to play a very important social capital, and where, we are teaching them on these concepts, coaching them on these concepts of the entire early childhood development. And this is the progress. And we also actually trying to look at how to, work on, providing all the supportive systems and, ensuring the positive parenting and strengthening our nutritional support. We also have a Poshan Abhiyan, a Government of India's program, which is again making a huge difference, basically mobilizing the entire, the public health systems to really focus on strengthening that nutrition and nutritional outcomes. And now the National Education Policy in 2020 also is talking about, introducing the element of educating children from 3 to 6 years, but we are also talking about what to do between 0 to 3 years. In fact, that also Niti Aayog is working on it, what kind of interventions have to be brought in. So there's a lot of work is happening, and very happy. This is the dream. We wanted to see that when if we invest here, I think if we can see a transformational or non-linear developmental outcomes, this is what we are expecting. And in fact, this is we are also actually, as our Honorable Prime Minister talks about cooperative federalism, we also have invited other states who are also interested in working in this field. We are all working together, to with this vision. And thank you very much for this. And I would like to, in fact, some questions to ask you, because he has actually one question that he wanted to say is that the numerous studies show excellent long-term gains from the investments in early childhood development. But however, what kind of results can expect in a short time frame, say in a matter of years? What kind of so some of these, like basically as these are some of the questions, but like I will request our Honorable Chief Minister just to make remarks, and after that we also will request our honorable member from Niti Aayog to make his remarks, and thereafter we will actually open it for questions and answers from various participants. Thank you very much.
A very good morning to Dr. Jack Shonkoff. It's evening here in India, of course. So very good evening to the rest, Dr. Vinod, K. Paul, and the entire team who have joined us from our state government as well as from the other state governments. And I know that there are many other people who have joined us online. So thank you so much for having agreed to come and discuss this very important subject, for the state of Meghalaya. I would like to start off by, catching on to what Professor, that what you have said, and also to what Mr. Sampath Kumar just mentioned, that we have clearly now defined a goal and a vision that we want to move forward towards. And we have broken it down into achievable goals. It may take some time, as you said, but we want to get there. And a simple line which we tell everybody is that our state of Meghalaya, in terms of the SDG goals and the per capita income goals, we are at the bottom 5 right now. And our target is to be in the top 10 in the next 10 years. And for that, of course, we are working towards ensuring that sectoral wise initiatives are taken. We realize that there has to be more monitoring and more detailed programs to be done for the SDG goals. So sector wise, we are moving on things. And obviously in terms of our per capita, also in GSDP, certain sectors are being given importance. And the entire process of taking the overall economy forward and obviously looking at the social sectors, all of these are areas which we're working on. But while we do that, we realize that we are working in this entire environment and an ecosystem. And the players and the stakeholders who are key to ensuring that we succeed in what we're doing need to have the capacity and need to be trained to be able to do more than what they're doing today. And that is the reason why we started off with what we have called the Meghalaya State Capability Forum. And this we're doing is because we realized that whether it's the legislatures, whether it's the bureaucrats, or whether it's the different stakeholders, we are not able to give the 70, 80, or 90% output that we are capable of doing. And hence the training and capacity building of individuals is required. And hence this entire exercise of involving all experts and learning from your experience, learning from what you have done in different situations is really what we're looking at. And therefore, I was listening to your speech and your presentation, and the way you presented and the way you were practical about everything. I sincerely and I very much I appreciate the way you have presented, because I am also of the same belief that we don't get results in days, and months. It doesn't work like that. You need to be consistent. You need to realize that you want to achieve that goal. Well, you will fall along the way, but then you get up and you keep going. And that's how we've been. And we're learning from our experiences. Everything is not perfect. We have a lot of challenges, but what is important to us is we will reach our goal, is the way we also see it. Second thing, which also I really appreciate, which you mentioned, is that it's not that the solution that has worked in another country will necessarily work for us. What is important to understand that there is a system and there are certain steps and certain principles that you have. But how you will apply those principles to the local conditions and challenges is something that we have to learn and adapt to it. And I think that's really important, because sometimes what happens in our country, that we have certain policies that come by the central government, the federal government, and they say, well, this has to be done. And then we tell them, well, it won't work here. And that's the problem sometimes we have with policy making, because India is a very diverse country, and the same yardsticks don't apply to all the states. And definitely the northeast part of India, and especially my state, is very different in terms of the challenges, and very different in terms of the advantages and the strengths that we have. So these are the 2 points that really connected me to your presentation, apart from obviously the overall science behind early childhood development. And to get to that, I also want to just mention to you that while we are looking at capacity building of our officials and legislatures, we also realized that the human resource and the individuals that we have in our state, the public, the population, we have a tendency to think about the children or worry about them suddenly when they don't clear the exams in class 10. And that's the secondary school level, what we call. So suddenly we wake up one day and we see that our results are only 50% pass mark. And then we say, oh my God, there's a big problem. We're not having the pass percentage. And not realizing that it is actually a result of the problem. That is not the problem. Problem is that we have not invested enough in the last 15 years for the child's life. And now we look at the results of the class 10 exams and we say, well, there's a problem with the class 10 exams. So what we realized is all of this starts right from the point where a child is conceived in the mother's womb. The kind of food, nutrition that goes in there, the care that the mother gets, the institutional delivery that is done, the high-risk mothers getting the right treatment at the right time. All of this goes into, obviously, then the 1,000 days when the child is born. And so when we realize that there is a science, obviously, behind it, and there needs to be proper policy, and as you said, there needs political will to make sure that we are in the right direction. I just wanted to give you a picture and tell you that this is exactly what we want to do. And that's why this early childhood development program is so crucial for us, because what we tell everybody is that Meghalaya is a population of 36 lakh people. That's like 3.6 million people. New Zealand is a state, as a country, which has about 4.6 million or about 5 million people. And the GSDP of Meghalaya is 5 billion, whereas the GSDP or the GDP of New Zealand is touching almost 300 billion. Now, what I'm trying to say here is just because, just with the additional population of another 10 lakhs or 1 million more, their economy is 1,000 times bigger than ours. Now, like you said, like, let's dream big so that it shocks us. I've been comparing New Zealand and Meghalaya all the time in almost all my speeches. And people say, well, we can't compare. And then I say, well, why can't we compare? Why can't our 3.6 million people be able to do exactly what the 4.6 million people in New Zealand are able to do? And so therefore, we realize that the capacity building and ensuring that each individual that grows up is productive, and ensuring that they get the right health, nutrition, as well as cognitive development was the basis of us starting this ECD program. Now, we are just starting off. We really don't know what to expect and how to move forward, but we know that we're on the right track. And obviously, experts like you and people who have seen this around the world are individuals who can really guide us and tell us and show us at least some of the mistakes that we would probably make, and make us realize that, well, we can do a few things to not make those mistakes. But I just wanted to assure all of you and tell you that we are really committed to doing this. And it's not about just this program. We have a program coming up for the adolescent girls. We have a very strong and robust youth policy that have come up. And we've realized that, as I said, we have a very strong program called the Mother Program, where we're taking care of the mothers when from the point of conception to the delivery, and ensuring that the institutional deliveries goes up and healthcare being given. So it's a very big, broad program, and this is part and one phase of the larger picture and the larger goal that we have. So I will leave you with that note, and to tell you that Meghalaya for us, in spite of all the challenges we have our inherent strengths, like the society we have. We are a very strong community-based society. So whenever we need to get into the grassroots level, the society comes forward. You know, we had COVID situations, you know, the society came forward, they put up quarantine centers, they took care of the people, government supported them, and that's how we work. And this is a very important part for us. And so we are working with those strengths. There are a lot of challenges. I don't want to go into details, but I just wanted to tell all of you that, that our vision is clear. We are very committed to those visions and those ideas. And with all your support and your help and guidance, we will try to take this forward to the logical conclusion.
But you've just inspired me with your comments, and I'll basically I want to make one response to that might be helpful for some of the questions you put out. But let you know that I really feel honored to be part of this conversation, and obviously the people of your region are awfully fortunate to have a chief minister like yourself with the words that you just spoken, without in any way minimizing how challenging all of this is. So I think there's an amazing opportunity that you have here to do something really important. And if you would, I think of some of your questions about, you know, recognize it's going to take a long time, but what can you expect in a short time, and the importance of thinking about the context in which the science gets applied and all of those things. I really mean this, I'm inspired by what you just said. I think the most important thing that you could do, or I don't know how much of this is even beyond your own power, but to basically take this fact that there is a very rich and underutilized science space here. Not that the science has all the answers, but it provides a very powerful framework for thinking about what should we do? How should we change what we're doing? This is how the progress got made in leukemia. It's how the breakthroughs happened in Apple. Is to say, we're going to make a very big difference here, but we have a lot of tough things to figure out. And I think the biggest challenge that early childhood policies and programs are facing all over the world, and especially in my own country, which has a long way to go, is that people feel so much pressure to produce positive results quickly, that what they do is they do whatever they're doing, and they measure everything they can think of measuring, looking for something that shows a positive effect so you can say we're making progress. And I think if you take what the science has to say and then ask this question of what do the families in your region want for their children? What would they consider to be, let's think of the short term and the long term. The short term is always tough. What would parents love to see change in their children in the next couple of years? What would people who provide services like to see to reinforce the fact that what they're doing is making a difference? And what do the policymakers want to see to say, I'm going to continue to invest? And develop a shared, agreed set of outcomes that you're going to look at, and not measure everything in the world, but measure those outcomes and ask for every program, for every policy, for every family, how is what we're doing likely to affect these outcomes? And if those are all aligned, you should expect to see progress. But then the issue will be, for whom are we making a big difference? For whom are we seeing these big impacts? And let's figure out what it is about them so that we can start to double down and scale for families and children who present in similar ways. And for whom are we not seeing any real impacts? And what is it that makes them different? And what should we be doing differently? What could we learn? And create an environment in which innovation thrives, which is to do honest evaluation and to never lose sight of the fact of what your goal is, but not be committed to anything that you're doing as the answer until you demonstrate it's the answer. And what the field is running into trouble with is people are just doing a whole lot of different things, measuring a whole lot of different things, and putting a lot of rhetoric out there. So you could create an environment that makes it safe to learn and succeed, and recognize that science and what parents want and what policymakers want and what service providers want are equally important. And the science has to be at the table, but so does the definition of what people think they're doing and what they want to be at the table. And accept that it will be an iterative process to get there. And you could be a model for the world because so few places are doing things that way. And you have the wisdom and the leadership of what you've just said to make that happen. It's hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because also the ultimate goal is not one program in one place that shows a big impact. Is how do you take that to scale? And you take it to scale by finding out more and more always of what's working and what's not, double down on what's working, and think about what to do differently, and see things that aren't working as an exciting opportunity to learn rather than something to hide from the funders. But you've inspired me with your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Shonkoff. I think this is great. And just I wanted to tell you what the experiment, what we are trying to make here is like the Perischool project at scale across the state. So that's the kind of a work that what we are trying to do. Or the New Zealand also is one of the examples that, like, they also invested in the early childhood development very well. So what I would like to now, like taking considering the precious time that we have with Dr. V.K. Paul, our honorable member, Niti Aayog, who has been actually leading all these ECD efforts from the Government of India.
Good evening, sir. Namaste. Honorable Chief Minister of Meghalaya, respected Shri Conrad K. Sanghaji, respected Dr. Jack Shonkoff, Sampath Kumarji, distinguished officials from the state of Meghalaya, distinguished colleagues who have joined this wonderful session, a treat from all parts of the country. Mera Abhinandan, Mera Namaste, and a very warm welcome to this discussion on behalf of Niti Aayog. Honorable Sir, I'm very proud that at the Niti Aayog, I am the focal point for your state. Under your leadership and in partnership with the team that you have created around you and the people of Meghalaya, I would be honored, and I am honored right now for being an extended part of your family and team to work toward the goals that you enunciated and you talked about. The Niti Aayog, for the information of Dr. Shonkoff, is the apex think tank of the Government of India. And this think tank is chaired by none other than the Honorable Prime Minister of India. So working with the progressive state and progressive leadership of the state of Meghalaya is my unique privilege, and I am very grateful to the God for this opportunity. Dr. Shonkoff, I am a pediatrician by training who some stage moved into health policy, and my area of work has been neonatology, newborn care, and then moving on to maternal health and then the larger policy space of health. So I can relate to the science. I can relate to the concept that you brought together today, and I'm truly grateful for educating us. I learned a great deal from your presentation. Sir, I got three important messages which have direct relevance to what we're trying to do. First and foremost is a reiteration of the fact that in health and nutrition, at least in these two areas, science and evidence should drive policy. The interventions that we wish to take to the concerned individual, the beneficiary, in the home settings, in workplaces, in schools, should be based on science and evidence. And as you correctly said, iteration should happen, improvement should happen. Today, we may be preventing diarrhea with oral rehydration solution. If you go back to early 90s, now we have rotavirus vaccine. So we add another iteration and another intervention. So thank you very much for laying down that high principle in this gathering and making a test case in the context of early childhood development. Your second point, which is a takeaway for my team here, is earlier the better. We come late, we've been trying to do some repair work, but why miss the opportunity at the earliest? And that, Honorable Chief Minister, sir, brings into the context that at the earliest stage, the children are in the family. Children are at home. They are not in school. They are not in creches. They are at home, which means whatever interventions we need to make to enrich the brain, to ensure early childhood development, it must happen at home and with the family, by enabling the families. That's my interpretation. So if you're looking at early childhood development, and if you're looking at in particular the earliest phase, then it's about fetal life, the 9 months, and from the focus of work that I'm carrying out right now, up to 6 years for sure, but particularly in 3 years, up to 3 years, which means 45 months of critical period where the child's abilities for cognition, for psychomotor capabilities, for behavior, and for tackling the environment, mental resilience and mental development, all that happens in the earliest phases, and the brain goes through tremendous changes. And if you don't use some of the connections or areas, then brain says, thank you very much. You don't need them. I'll work with the ones that you need them, and they're gone for practical purposes forever. So that's, you enforce the science of this fundamental logic, which Mr. Sampath Kumar highlighted, and we are making this as a part of our endeavor as we move forward. The third message that you gave is critical, and you said stress needs to be tackled. Stress needs to be converted into, by some mechanisms, as resilience. Here, I would say that fortunately for India and for Meghalaya, racism, violence, genocide, disruption of families, fortunately is not there for India. We were so fortunate, so lucky in that regard. Yes, we have poverty. Yes, indeed, we have poverty. But then in the context of India, the family system and the culture and the traditions are so strong. I hope and I believe that they offset the stresses of poverty. And I also would like to make a point here that we cannot wait for our children to realize their best potential until and unless we have eliminated poverty. Elimination of poverty is a longer term effort. Can we short circuit? Can we create an environment around the child which is nurturing enough, even in low resource settings? In the context of health in general, particularly and in addition, in the context of MDGs, I learned, and I sort of practiced in some sense in my work, that we don't have to wait for per capita income to reach a certain level before we can eliminate measles, or to reduce diarrheal deaths, or reduce infant mortality, or to reduce, more difficult, the maternal mortality. So my hope is, and maybe you would like to respond to this, can we short circuit poverty? I cannot wait for poverty to be taken care of, even in the best circumstances, in 2 decades or 1 decade or whatever. I don't want to put any timeline to it. I want to make sure that the child born today can, with the help of champions like the Honorable Chief Minister, champions like Sampath, champion like some of the team members that I have here, can we create an environment that the child born today can be ensured a nurturing environment and achieves the optimum child development. Included alongside this is an important point of relevance to the audience here. A stress that we cannot possibly avoid the consequences of is the fetal growth restriction. Unfortunately, we have 15 to 20 to 25% fetal growth restriction incidence in our pregnancies. So we end up with intrauterine growth retardation. We end up with children who are small for dates. Well, their stress, not easy to change because partly it is epigenetic, partly it is related to several other factors, not easy. To make a huge difference is relatively difficult. So I bow to the logic that stress, notwithstanding, whatever best we can do to the child of the day, and those, of course, who are free from intrauterine growth restriction, should achieve the best possible cognition, behavior, sensory development, mental development, and so on and so forth. So these are my 3 takeaways. But the question is, we cannot wait for poverty to be eliminated fully and to become totally stress-free before we act on ensuring that the child gains the best possible development. Sir, very briefly, with our team here, we are working on creating pathways for improved early childhood development in the course of 0 to 3 years. As was mentioned, 3 to 6 years is being addressed as a part of policy. There was a policy gap, a relative policy gap, which this policy think tank is trying to fill. We've looked at the best practices from several states, and I'm very happy to say that Meghalaya stands out as a fascinating positive story, along with 4 or 5 other states. And we are drawing upon those lessons. And those lessons lead, and also to look at NGO projects and also academic projects. And what they lead us to say is what you highlighted. It is a family. It is what we do to enable the family that would make a difference. And how to do it involve not just the mother, but the father as well, and the grandmother, and the grandfather, and the uncle, to create an environment which builds on what the families in any case do to ensure their children are smart. But it will be also about how to ensure interaction, using play, using toys, using messaging on their cell phones, maybe a poster at home, and creating a buzz through other means. But you do need a coach, and I think that's a wonderful point that you made. You need a facilitator. You need a worker who will do this, and we have some paradigm to work with. But the last point in that paradigm is the involvement of the community, and thank you for highlighting that. Community participation. And my Prime Minister says people's movement or Jan Andolan. You need for any program a Jan Andolan. These are the strands that I see, but we need to work with tools, and we make sure how these tools reach every home. And at this point, let me say that the quotation that you put forth is my favorite too. But I want to read the first part of that quotation for the colleagues here, because we are a team, and across this we have a team trying to do things in constrained situations. And then how do you dream beyond what you can achieve through the constrained situation? And that's where Madame Sirleaf says, and I quote, "The size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them." Don't think about the dreams which fit into what you have today. The capacities increase. Capacities increase, resources come. So don't be minimalistic. So the size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them. Then it says, she says, if your dreams do not scare you, they are not big enough. So I stand with that philosophy. I teach this to my students, and thank you for bringing this quotation, which for sometimes I have not used because in this capacity, I don't see students on a daily basis, but yes, I do have students around me. Having said that, my final remarks, I'm honored to hear from the Honorable Chief Minister that he would like to see Meghalaya as the cognitive capital of India. And let me push that frontier coming from the union government and the federal system that my great nation has, that we would like to see, we would like to dream for India to be the cognitive capital of the world. We have to harness the demographic dividend that we have, fortunately, in the next 25 to 30 years. And in that regard, our endeavor toward ensuring optimum child development is an imperative, a necessity, so to say. And therefore, in the end, with the dream of making India a cognitive capital, I thank you once again, Meghalaya, for the opportunity. I thank you, Dr. Shonkoff, for stimulating more thoughts, more discourse, more understanding through your scintillating lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. B.K. Paul, sir. Thank you very much for your remarks and also the questions that actually, the reflections that you have shared. So one of the reflections of what you shared is that, especially the last reflection, how we can really dream, we should dream big. And one thing that we would like to share with everyone, all the, in fact, the members who are participating in this session, we are making a kind of an experiment, but we are finding very interesting results. There is a huge amount of resources that what we have within the states, different departments. We have a health department, we have a social welfare department, we have a community and rural development department. When we start working with a collaborative approach, we would be able to see significant results. So this is the concept that what we are talking about, the state capability approach, where bringing that collaborative approach and in fact bringing that mission and the intrinsic motivation within the government workforce along with other stakeholders, I think we can achieve greater results. This is something that we are working in Meghalaya. We would like to share this one. And now I think there are some more, in fact, very interesting, a lot of people wanted to ask some questions. Like there is one Dr. Vinita Kaul. She headed the Early Childhood Development Center at Dr. Ambedkar University. I think she would like to make some question to you, Dr. Shonkoff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sampath. And what a pleasure to be able to listen to Dr. Shonkoff. It's really an opportunity for us. And I would like to say it's very coincidental that today is Guru Purnima. And each one of us who has worked in the field of early childhood education and care have been quoting Dr. Shonkoff perhaps every day. So it's a tremendous opportunity to see our Guru and listen to him. And it's really thank you to Mr. Sampath for making this possible. My question, Dr. Shonkoff, is that you've talked about all the stressors and how toxic stress can be really kind of a factor in not only the immediate but the later development of children. Where does technology come into all this? Because the technology is a new entrant into the world of children, especially with COVID, that has come in a very major way. So has there been some kind of studies, research done to study the impact of technology on the young developing brain of the child?
Thank you very much for that question. It gives me a chance to say one thing I always hope there's an opportunity to say, which is that anytime you bring anyone in to speak who's presented as an expert, if that person never says, I don't know, in response to a question, don't trust what that person says. So my first reaction is I'm not an expert on that, and I'm sure there is a lot of knowledge about that I don't know. I mean, I think, there are impressions about the fact that technology, with all of its benefits, is changing some of the nature of the early childhood experience to its detriment. The one thing that we do know is that very early in the first few years of life, learning is a highly interactive process for the brain, and that no matter what kind of technology we develop, that these kind of quote educational videos for babies and things like that, we know biologically from animal studies as well that brain development and brain circuitry is dependent on kind of reciprocal interaction with real people, right? So I think we have to be very wary of replacing human interaction with kind of technological ways of enhancing learning when children are very young. That doesn't mean as kids get older, that can't be valuable. But I'm going to pivot a little bit for your question to say something that I think is really important for a number of the comments that have been made before, including some of Dr. Paul's comments, which is that as we think about how to position early childhood among competing interests in the government, let's say, there's a Ministry of Health, there's a Ministry of Education, there's a Ministry of Economic Development. In the educational world, there are people involved in technology, there are people involved in other things, and how do we create an early childhood kind of space? And I think the answer is we should not be trying to create separate ministries and departments of early childhood. We should be bringing an early childhood lens to every one of these other domains. So that I would say that for the technology area, which I don't have expertise in, we need people in technology who are looking at this through an early childhood lens, rather than have early childhood think about how to bring technology in the same way that for all of the governmental programs that you're talking about, my sense is the best way to get traction for this is to make sure that an early childhood lens is deeply embedded in all of these existing systems that have a lot of power and a lot of influence and have most of the resources. And the same thing with the family. You know, I think, yes, exactly, the family is critical, but there also is the danger to kind of put both the credit and the blame on families and not recognize that what goes on in the larger context either makes it easier or harder for families. So I think we're going to have to address the technology issue. I think families are asking for, will have varying access to technology, and those who have access are asking for guidance. But I think we need to infiltrate the technology world and have early childhood thinking in the technology world, and based on sophisticated knowledge, not just based on what kind of technology can we make available and try to sell to families and programs.
Thank you.
There are two questions I have. Like there is one thing that we always talk about is that we have great studies. We also have the Nobel Prize winner Heckman's research on early childhood development. And the World Bank, since 2014, it has mentioned about the importance of ECD. In fact, early childhood learning. In fact, they also compared, like, if you invest during the early childhood preschool period, you will get more results, than your investment at a later period. So when we have a whole lot of data is there. How I think basically you have been working with various policymakers. How actually to see that, like, how to promote the greater investments in the early childhood. This is one question that one of the members wanted to ask. I thought I will put before you, Dr. Shonkoff. How to really, because yes, in Meghalaya and some states actually already initiated, but I'm generally, because this is something a great, as you mentioned about the study of that, an example, the analogy that you gave about Apple, to create the transformative development. I think there is a great opportunity we could see in the science of early childhood development, how that can be brought as a major focus, how to actually communicate this one, advocate this one. This is something that we are working with the Center for Policy Research. We also are working on this advocacy part too. Dr. Shonkoff.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I know Jim Heckman well and have huge respect for the contributions he's made and his brilliance as an economist. So, and I think that is both an example of what we need to learn from, and also an example of where the limitations are of generalizing from single studies. So Professor Heckman's work has been very elegant analyses of basically two programs, two iconic demonstration projects, the Perry Preschool Project and the Abecedarian Project, each of which is a randomized control trial of 100 children, in each, 50 in the treatment group and 50 in the kind of control group, and long-term studies were done. So what that work has done is, in a very compelling way, has shown us what's possible, in a highly controlled setting, with very well-trained staff, and very intensive intervention. And the challenge is that neither the Perry Preschool Project nor the Abecedarian Project has been taken to scale and has been shown to kind of have comparable impacts. In fact, that's been the story for a lot of the early education programs, is that when they take into scale with larger numbers, the average effects are lower. And so there are a couple of ways that people look at that. You could say, well, the average effects are lower because they weren't implemented as well, or you can think of a whole lot of examples. But I think what the science is telling us is that average effects are masking big effects and no effects, right? So that, and when the field was beginning, demonstration projects that were kind of nice little hothouse examples were really important to kind of establish a base. But now the issue is, how do we have impact at scale? And I think one of the most important messages, I'm just repeating what I said earlier, is to kind of not be caught up in this process of looking at mean effects. Because, and this is actually economics, which is tremendously important here, very much focuses on mean effects and doesn't focus on what the causal mechanisms are. That's not what economists do. And so it's not taking away from their critical importance. It's certainly not taking away from Jim Heckman's contributions, but the science is screaming. So if we asked what's the average effect of the treatment of cancer, we'd come out with some number that would be something between 100% survival for some and 0% for survival for others, and therefore not reflect reality of what we're dealing with. So that's kind of what I think the field has to come to grips with, and policymakers certainly need to address, because for policymakers, it's about impact at scale. It's not about a demonstration project. So we have to go back to all the things that have been spoken about and that Dr. Paul was very eloquent in speaking about in terms of kind of understanding the individual variation.
Thank you, Dr. Shonkoff. This is great. And there are some questions actually which are typed in the message box. We would like to read out for you.
Yes. So Professor Shonkoff, I'll just read one question from Sumita Ghosh of the Ministry of Health, India. What are the basic tenets of responsive parenting?
The basic tenets of responsive parenting. That's a great question, because I mean, there's a lot of science about that, but also your grandmother could tell you that. And you don't need to be a scientist to kind of know what responsive parenting is, because responsive parenting is built into our genes. It's why we haven't been extinct as a species, because humans are tremendously helpless for a long period of time. So in its simplest form, responsive parenting, once we get past all the jargon and the sophisticated studies, which are very elegant and very important, it's this notion that adults who care for very young children become engaged in this process of reading each other and understanding each other and being involved in what we term serve and return interactions. So right from the beginning, you don't have to have a bachelor's degree in child development. If an adult, a caregiver, is holding a baby and that baby smiles, you can't help but smile back. It's not something you had to learn in a course on child development. We're wired to do that. And if a baby makes sounds and coos and gurgles, we do that back. And when we do that, the babies do that back. It's built in to our biology. And most of the time it's there. When it gets disrupted, either because some of the more common examples are, for example, caregivers who have severe depression, which is not uncommon, and therefore are not able to be responsive, not because they don't love the child, but because they're overwhelmed by depression or by addictions, or overwhelmed by the stresses of poverty, or the stresses of being in a violent, unsafe environment that disrupt your availability to engage. But responsive parenting, if we want to know what it is, just go around and look at a whole bunch of parents engaging with their kids, and you'll see it in every social class. It's that reciprocal, responsive, back and forth interaction that's cued into that child. And including for children who are very sensitive, responsive parenting, parents, the burden early on is on the parent to kind of learn what's unique about the child, not on the child to adapt to the parent. And so some kids get overstimulated very easily. You need to kind of be quiet and gentle. And some need to be kind of juiced up, jazzed in. You need to, and it's all, most of this happens naturally, except when biology is designed to get it right. When things go wrong, it's because other things are interfering, not because we're not smart enough to do it. Mental illness, addictions, violence, severe stress related to poverty, that disrupts it. In responsive parenting, we shouldn't be spooked out by it. You don't need a PhD to define it. You know it when you see it. It's interactive, it's personalized, it's individualized. It's not the same for everybody. That's why in programs, good caregivers in programs don't respond the same way to all children. They individualize. And that's what builds resilience.
Thank you very much. This is great. And in fact, one of the things that I would like to just state from what actually our Dr. V.K. Pal, our Honorable Member Niti Aayog mentioned about, especially in the resource poor settings. And especially when, we have poverty, but still we really wanted to, we can't eliminate the poverty, but we still wanted to, make sure that, we provide that greater support to the families. So for this, actually, I wanted to share it with you. This is something that's very interesting that is happening in India. Everyone, we across the country, we are having these women from rural areas have been mobilized as women self-help groups. And they meet like on every week. They sit, they share, they discuss about the issues concerning their lives. And it's a beautiful program. So what actually we are trying to do in Meghalaya is that leveraging this entire science of ECD through the self-help group women's network. So this is something that, we can actually do it, they are poor, but actually they have certain support systems. Like that's where the self-help groups we are using. So I just wanted to share that they're also going to play a very important role in that responsive positive parenting. So thank you so much for this. And any other questions that anyone have, like the last question we can take. I request Mr. Ramakrishna, who is actually leading that women self-help group program in the state. So I request Ramakrishna to make his question. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning, Dr. Shonkoff. My question would be, especially after the COVID and with the advent of mobile phones, now there is an increased incidence of children on the spectrum, ASD, at risk for ASD also. Especially with respect to virtual autism, there are some studies also coming up now. In this setting, what are the precautions that a caretaker can take so that the child will not go into the spectrum? And the second thing, is it prudent to go for an universal screening of children to detect spectrum? Because as you have shown in the first slide, the brain plasticity is highest at the youngest stages. If we wait till the caretaker finds some symptoms and comes to the facility, that window might be lost. So, however, on the other hand, if we start universal screening, since it is a very wide spectrum, even when the child is at the mild end of the spectrum, parents will be unnecessarily worried. So what will be a prudent way to go forward based on your experience in the US? Because I heard in US, the universal screening is the norm.
Yeah, no, these are all such wonderful questions. I really appreciate the question. And this will have to be the last one because I'm going to have to go, but it gives me an opportunity to respond specifically to what you're asking and then to kind of relate it to some broader issues, some of which have been themes all through this session. So yes, autism spectrum disorder, back in the day when I went to medical school and I was trained in pediatric residency, autism was a very rarely encountered phenomenon, and it was at the very severe end of the spectrum. And this notion of a spectrum did not exist, and it's been developed over time. And I think one of the things you pointed out that's very important is that when you talk about the more severe end, these are clearly children with significant developmental needs who need to be connected with appropriate services very early in life, no question about that. But as you start to kind of broaden the spectrum, you now start to get into a lot of children who in the past were not diagnosed with a condition, but were seen as children who are kind of, a little bit more difficult in their social connections, maybe some problems with communication. And so the diagnostic category here, and again, I'm not an expert in ASD, so experts may kind of take some exception with what I'm saying, is I think when you get to the milder end, there's no diagnostic test, right? So it's a clinical impression. And so there is a danger of over-medicalizing the variability in development. And just as you said, you put a diagnostic label on it that has a significant impact on the family that then sees the child as different from just they used to see him or her as socially hard to engage, and now see the child with a disorder. And that's something we need to be very careful about. But there's no question that early intervention in those kinds of situations are important. And this is where you want a system where you don't have to have a diagnosis to get assistance for the family and help. But the bigger issue here in terms of universal screening, this is a huge problem in the United States, that's a problem all over the world, is that screening and the basic principles of screening and the justification for screening is you don't screen for things unless you're going to do something about it if you find something. And for some people, screening is the answer. We're going to have screening programs. We're going to do all these assessments. And then there's no value to screening if, number one, there's nothing you're going to do with what you find. Or number two, you find things and you wish you could do something, but then you have nothing to offer. So screening has to be seen as the first step of identification to then decide you're going to do something different. And if you can't do something different, or you're not prepared for that, then screening is not only a waste of resources, but it can sometimes do more harm than good because it labels children and then leaves people without anything to do. So and it gets, again, always for me, all roads lead back to the variability issue. And then when we look at variability, you have to understand that variability is not just the difference between kids who have diagnostic problems and kids who don't, but there's huge variability in the general normal population. That's the nature of who we are. And we have to be very careful about avoiding labeling children, taking a deficit approach with good intentions, but then it can do more harm. And the last thing about these parent support groups, which is very important, they can be a very powerful vehicle. I really applaud that because in many cases, this may not only be the most effective, but the most realistic way to provide support for a wide range of problems. And again, like everything else, this is, I think, I've been obsessing on this, but this is the way I will leave this. So years ago, I used to do a lot of work in the disability area where parent support groups were tremendously important. And we did a study in one area where we assessed the parents' views about the parent support groups in the program. And about the overwhelming majority, about 80% of the parents said that the support group, the informal support group, was the most important thing for them. It was life-saving. They valued it equally, and in some cases more, than specialized services. And there were about 15%, 20% of the respondents who said they found the support groups to be additional stress because they didn't feel comfortable talking to other parents about things they were troubled with. And they didn't want to listen to other people's problems. They had enough problems of their own. So again, everything we do, we have to be asking, not is this the thing to do, but for whom is it going to be effective? And for whom is it going to be less effective? And for whom might it even be detrimental? So I say amen and applaud the support groups and recognizing, like everything else, may not be the right thing for everybody.
Thank you very much for the wonderful session we have had, and it's a great session, and the participation of our Honorable Chief Minister and Dr. V.K. Paul from the Niti Aayog has really enriched the discussion with great insights. But this is amazing because it gives us a lot of inspiration. This session is participated by all the deputy commissioners who are in charge of the district administration in the state. So they actually, they head the district administration and they oversee all the developmental programs, especially focusing on human development. So they're all watching, they're all, in fact, with a lot of curiosity and a lot of, interest. We hope that this session would really help us to, strengthen our efforts. And as just to tell to all of you, we are using an iterative approach. We call like problem-driven iterative adaptive approach, PDII. So this approach we are following in terms of designing and also implementing this program. Thank you very much. And I thank Dr. V.K. Paul, sir, for your time and for your guidance that you have given to all of us through this. And we really look forward to your guidance in the days to come. And thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants who are participating here. A lot of experts are there, and also a lot of senior officers from the Ministry of Health, the Additional Secretary and Managing Director, National Health Mission of Government of India. Madam, she's also here. And I thank each one of you for participating in this. And also from Telangana, I can see a lot of participation and other states too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Shonkoff. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much as well.